Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. So today we are in the final part of this four-part series of the commentary on the epic sword fighting image. Now if you made it this far and you've watched all the other parts, congratulations. Hopefully you'll get some closure from this video. If this is your first time, check the links below to see kind of all of the steps that we've taken to get to the place that we're starting at. And essentially what that's been is just starting with two images, one of two sword fighters in their native background, removing that background and superimposing them onto a new background, adjusting that background or that new image so that it's a nighttime image with a new light source being the swords instead of the just general overhead lighting. And then I'm using Particle Shop plugin to add some effects and beginning to recolorize the scene based on that. So we're starting off this part 4 video and then concluding with just finishing touches and finishing colorizing the defender and doing a little bit of framing and those kinds of minor lighting adjustments. So we'll just focus on the parts that matter and we'll get to the end and then we'll be done. So let's get to it. So just a quick recap of the layout of this project. Starting at the bottom layer, you can see we just have a black background. Then we have a layer group, which has our background elements, and this is where we have the many layers that are contributing to our ability to have a nighttime scene plus the daytime layer showing through via mask. Then we have the same type of layer group setup for both what I'm calling the attacker and the defender. And then on separate layers, what you'll see is we just have a few raster layers of the special effects and some of the colorization that comes with that. So that's our current setup. Let's head back into the actual actions that are left remaining to complete this image. So at this stage, the defending orb, this greater blue, sort of emanating shine is covering a little bit too much of the defender. So what I've done is created a mask layer that's a show all mask layer on the blue orb layer. I'm adjusting the opacity just so that it's, it's easier to see the defending figure underneath. And then now, just as we have with many of the other layers that we use mask, just using a black paintbrush to allow the figure to come through. Now, it could be argued that this layer could just be moved behind the figure and then we would get a similar kind of effect here, but I did want to have some of it kind of bleeding over in some cases, and really all this is trying to do is just not take away the focus of the defender from this special effect. So it's like just trying to create emphasis, focal point, but still having this sort of atmospheric effect of the shield over the figure. So that's why we're not dragging it just straight behind. So now, reevaluating just the geometry of the light source, I kind of determined that it probably made more sense for his legs to be lit up a little bit more. So going back to the defender's mask and then just painting black to have some more of that artificial shine on his leg. And then sampling the blue and then going back to the layer that represents the overlay color on the figure. We got to change that blend layer to color legacy and then just start painting that blue on top of it. So this way we're kind of having instead of just an artificial light source, we're having a colored artificial light source. And you can see I'm being a little bit generous here and in some ways, kind of going a little bit liberal with how that brush is being used creates almost like a pseudo halo around him. And I was kind of okay with that. So now fine-tuning the mask on the background, just recognizing that probably more parts of the more foregroundish background elements, like where he's standing or kneeling, those should probably be a little bit more lit up given the proximity to this blue light source, which is his sword. And this is sort of the iterative process, right? As you develop more parts of the image, or as more parts of the image, become more refined, and then you have to kind of back up and reevaluate what you've done and kind of take it in as a whole and decide, does it make sense still, or is the image still as continuous as you would like it to be? And if not, wherever that is, just make some adjustments. And so that's kind of the stage we're at, right? As the image is really kind of coming to its end here. A lot of the steps that you're going to see are really just fine tunings of either the last bit of adjustments that I'm doing or just reevaluating the image as a whole. All right, so next, coming back to the attacker, and recognizing that he really should also be affected by this blue light source. Going to his colorization layer, keeping geometry in mind, and then just kind of painting over the sides of his body and face that would be primarily lit up by this light. Not only does it create just more color for the scene in general, but it also just really more so sells sort of this multi-lighting sort of, this simulated multi-lighting sort of effect. So now, visiting the background and specifically the vignette layer, just trying to hone in on the lighted area, right? How do we put more emphasis on our target subject, which is the two fighters, right? So changing the background vignette to overlay just helps darken those edges even further. So now, looking at the defender and looking specifically at his light source, what I kind of gathered was it seemed like the contrast should have been higher, right? That given that we're kind of no longer in a soft light environment, diffuse soft light like he originally was, the shadow on the far side of the glowing sword probably should be nearly black, right? I mean, it really doesn't have much light source to it except for maybe minor reflections from the environment. So using the paintbrush, or sorry, using the burn tool, basically the burn brush, and then that just has the effect of really darkening already dark parts, and then transitioning and doing this same sort of effect on the attacker. And the whole idea, just trying to make it a little bit more refining this sort of artificial lighting that we've created. So given the fact that we've darkened the figures, we're going to have to kind of do something similar to make the shadows a little bit more in alignment with that. So returning back to the shadows layer, what we want to do is kind of intensify the darkness and maybe even sharpness of that shadow. But what's challenging is that since the pixels used for that shadow are probably all pure black anyway, or dark gray, traditional methods of quote-unquote darkening kind of don't apply. So ultimately it becomes just a matter of using the paintbrush and just straight using the black color at full opacity, and then using the eraser to refine it a little bit. And like I mentioned in a previous video, the quality of this shadow is really what sets this figure into the scene. If this shadow doesn't look right, then it's going to make it a lot harder for this figure to feel like he actually exists right where he does. It'll feel much more like he's just floating in front, which is what we're trying to avoid. So feeling like the shadow is at least good enough for now. Coming back to the layer of the defensive orb and just making minor adjustments here. wanting to allow the figure to come through a little bit more. Now returning to the foreground, feeling like there's a lack of saturation on the fire side, or the red side, if you will. So, addressing that by painting over a little bit more. Returning also to the jumping figure's shadow and making some adjustments there, both between opacity and blend layer, changing it to hard light. So next I'm realizing that the figures are in sort of like an odd composition at the moment. So I'm experimenting now with different possible alternative compositions. My preference normally is in HD. I like to just keep my images in the HD, ratio of height and width. But in this case, I think in my mind, it just didn't work out. So then my next go-to is kind of like square. The thought maybe is the square resolution might work, but I kind of wasn't happy with that one either. So in the cases where I can't quite get it to be exactly what I want it to be, then we just go custom resolution, or custom aspect ratio. So this, now I was just adjusting to what I kind of liked, which kept the figures mostly centered, but kind of hitting the bottom left and the top right third. So now that we've readjusted that cropping, that framing of the image, you'll notice that it caused our vignette to be misaligned, because that vignette was applied per the original dimensions of the image. So we'll delete that one. And we can very simply recreate this vignette by creating a new raster layer and then filling with that same gradient fade to transparency material. And now to give it the very strong effect, we're going to change its blend layer type to burn and then reduce the opacity so that we're kind of bringing more of the central elements back out. But you'll see that this effect really hyper focuses our attention towards the center of the image where all the action is happening. Now, with this sort of reframing now, though, I say compositionally it feels a lot like that defensive orb, the larger ring, if you will, is going too far out into the edges. So we're going to just bring it back in by adjusting the mask, painting black with a soft edge brush. And this just kind of keeps all that highlighted action right in the middle. So now just doing manual refinement on the vignetting, right? Like if I felt like there was a little bit too much lighted areas distracting around the edges, in a way, the vignette layer, even though it's not a mask, just by painting black with a soft edge brush kind of allows you to manipulate it in that same kind of way. So then now just doing other fine adjustments. I really wanted the sword's lighting effect to not be hindered by its like light fire trail, so I moved that layer up. And then there was sort of this, explosive halo kind of fire effect right behind the attacking figure. It felt a little too strong. It was a little bit too distracting. So here I'm trying to just experiment and play with how can I blend it into the scene or make it less prominent. So I'm changing blend layers and I'm adjusting its lighting. All right, so then popping around and trying to find the thing that just bothers me most about the image at the moment. Here we're kind of coming back to the defender, and we're coming back to the shadow, right? That we kind of refined in trying to make the lighting a little bit more harsh. And what you'll kind of notice is that the defending figure has this sort of halo, right? Where the background eraser, or whatever you want to call it, didn't quite, make a clean sort of cut, around him. That's what we need to kind of get rid of. Otherwise, it really has this sort of artificial look where that shadow blends in with the background and the shadow underneath him. So there's a few things that I try here. Honestly, I'm not going to go into detail of some of the things that I tried, because in hindsight they weren't really good ideas. Like, I was trying to use the magic wand and then try to do a contraction on it to see if I could kind of just cut out the sort of outer edge, around him. But I realized there were like unintended side effects of doing that, and it didn't quite have the effect that I wanted. But this is where it comes back to that whole concept of, what level of quality and what kind of trade makes sense for what you're trying to do. And at this stage, what I kind of finally fell on was just the concept of saying, it'll be very simple if I just paint, a really dark color, or like black, where this halo overlaps with the shadow, and be done with it. And what we'll see is the effect is equally as good, and probably saved me a lot more time than all of these other weird selection-based approaches that I was trying. Now, on close inspection though, you might look at it and be able to see some artifacts about it that really aren't very, convincing. But again, in aggregate, viewing the image from afar, it's good enough. So then, now that we've kind of fixed that halo problem, just doing some minor tweaking to the shadow overall felt like it was a little too long. Although geometrically it probably should be longer. Again, this is just reevaluating the image to see, what minor tweaks at this stage, or last tweaks, right? To really just, nail down the details that maybe are bugging you, or that you feel like compositionally just improve how the image looks. So again, kind of revisiting the vignetting and emphasizing, darkening the edges just to really focus the center. And then for this next phase, I'm going to kind of speed up just a little bit. It's really just layer management, so I'm renaming layers. This is good to do, or is often better to do like in the middle, not necessarily near the end. But you may, if you're just really feeling the flow and, you're just going, that's not something you always think about. But if you find yourself constantly switching between layers, trying to figure out what is what, that's kind of a good indicator that maybe you should stop where you're at and then go through this process. It can be helpful to do it in the end though, if you're trying to make minor tweaks and you have so many layers that you're kind of forgetting what's what and where's where. So now revisiting the background, layer, that sort of color, right underneath, it felt like where the two colors were blending, there was sort of like a lack of saturation. It seemed kind of muted right in the middle there. So just using the hue, up down brush, or the tool, if you will, just to try to increase that saturation a little bit, make it a little bit more consistent. A little bit more layer management now that I'm in the background group. And then at this stage, I kind of realized that some of the background is popping a little bit more than I kind of would expect it to, especially since our light sources are right in front of us there. So, usually when you have a bright light source and a dark background, that contrast is going to be the greatest right where the light source is. So just continuing to paint on this vignette layer that's set to burn, and just by painting a little bit of black in there, you can see it's really darkening the background right behind the glowing swords. And at this stage, we have come to the conclusion and we have finished this image. And if you've made it this far, congratulations. You know, the goal of this wasn't so much to, you know, just be able to recreate this image or even something similar to it. The real hope is that in this full, you know, real time, you know, only strategically sped up, but really trying to keep it in its original pace, that you'll learn a lot, both just from what tools I use, what techniques I used, how I used them, and then also just some of the, you know, little token information, that's sort of the rationale or the insights that I apply in my creative process. My hope is that all of that information has been helpful for you in this like nearly, you know, over an hour plus of content working on a singular image and seeing it literally end to end, beginning to end, how we got there. If there's any part of this where it wasn't clear, or you would like to see a little bit more in-depth on a particular tool or capability or something like that, feel free to leave a comment. I'm definitely interested in deep diving in something specific, but this is really just more of an overview, right, of a full image project. Anyway, as usual, that's it for me. If you have any questions in general or would like to leave a suggestion of content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of future videos that I create and other content, feel free to subscribe. If you'd like to support me and the channel, check out my Patreon page, which is on the link on the TV, and I'll see you guys next time.